Let's go back here now to the reign of Pius XII.
Yes.
He put out an encyclical called Mediator Dei.
1946.
Yes. So this liturgical movement must have been active long before the Novus Ordo Mass was introduced.
In the 1930s, it was. And in that Mediator Dei, as you've known, but let's remind our listeners, he actually says, and there are some people who want to take away the tabernacle from the altar. He listed all the
They want to take away black vestments.
That's right. That's right. They want the place to face the people. But why did he do that? Because in Belgium and France and Germany of the 30s, there was a movement, a liturgical movement, mainly started by Benedictines, but also supported by the Jesuits, which proposed all these things, proposed people masses. And when it came to the Vatican Council itself, as you know, the last vote in the Council in 1965 concerned the Mass. And the bishops were absolutely categorical. They said, do not wipe out the Latin, keep the Latin Mass, but translate the popular part, meaning the Credo, the Gloria, the prayer before Mass, the Introibo Mass, prayers as we call them, and the communion prayers at the end. Put those in the popular language. But the canon stands. This was the Council. And I remember that a bishop who had visited Paul VI just after the end of the Council in December 1965 came in to me here in New York and said, you know, Malachi, the most extraordinary thing happened to me. I was speaking with the Pope, His Holiness, 2 days ago. And I congratulated him on the vote in the Council. And he said, don't speak to me about the vote. Don't congratulate me. There are already 18 new canons in vogue in France. They've gone haywire. They've already translated into vernacular. And the thing is not valid anymore. And I had no control over it. So what happened? Well, there was a character called Bugnini, Annibale Bugnini, who was a Freemason, member of the lodge, who set as his goal to create a new ceremony in the Catholic Church. He has this in his articles published in the Italian Revista, which could be accepted by anybody, Catholic or non-Catholic or non-Christian.
So it's an ecumenical religion, and because Bugnini was a Freemason, one wonders if he was doing this in the long run to lead towards the creation of a one-world religion.
Of course he was. Of course he was. The difficulty is that he wasn't alone. He had powerful friends. And by the way, just as a footnote, you know that the official canon of the Mass now, the new Mass, the Novus Ordo, was composed by 6 Protestant clergymen and 2 Catholic clergymen. I mean, how bastardized can you become? No matter how pious and good these men were, they're not Catholics. They didn't know the Catholic tradition. But anyway, let's go on. What we have to acknowledge too is that there was a very carefully laid out integrated plan to make sure that no statement of the Vatican Council, if possible, couldn't be ambivalent. And I remember Cardinal Bea coming to see me once in my room in Rome, and this was 1962, sweating. And the Council had just begun, it was November 1962. And I asked him why he was disturbed. He said, because I've just heard an awful remark by Hans Kung. He was talking to, and he named an American theologian, who is now a bishop, who shall remain unnamed. And he said, Kung, in answer to a question by this man, I didn't hear the question, said, oh, no. This time we're not going to leave. We're not going to have another Reformation. We're staying inside this time. Which gives an eye-opener on what the plan was. And the plan was simply to make sure that the traditional Romanist Catholic traits of the Church would be wiped out. The result is that if you examine all the documents of the Vatican Council, there are 15 main ones, you'll find that except for something like the Mass, what it says about the Mass, the old Mass, the Roman Mass, as I always call it. I refuse the name Tridentine even, because Trent did not invent this Mass. It was the old Roman Mass celebrated by Pope Damasus in the 5th century. The idea was to make sure that no statement of the Council would stand that could not be interpreted ambivalently. For instance, nuns must modernize their dress. It's quite clear from the discussions in the Council at that time, they meant, well, get rid of things which are really a hindrance, say, in a subway, or a hindrance simply are out of place. They certainly didn't mean nuns to walk around with pearl necklaces and lipstick and powder and hot pants and hot dresses and to sit in cocktails in large hotels having their annual conventions. They meant nuns to have a garb, a religious garb, a sign of their devotion to the spouse they had married by their vows.
What seems to have happened is a complete revolution, because for a nun to go from heavily garbed into lipstick and watching television and miniskirts, it's a total turnaround.
It was destruction. It was destruction. Not only that, but there were a whole, as you know, in California, there was a whole set of schools. Simply, all the nuns simply left the order, left the church. But that was carefully done in the Vatican Council. Everything was left ambivalently. And the main thing was left ambivalent was religious liberty and the idea of communism. As you know, 500 fathers asked Paul VI to allow them condemn communism. They were forbidden. That was one of the agreements that John III made with Nikita Khrushchev. That was one of the things that haunts us today.
Let's talk about this Rome-Moscow agreement. What is this Rome-Moscow agreement?
Well, the Rome-Moscow agreement is very simple. John III did feel that if he could get 2 Russian observers in Rome for the council, that it would be Pentecostal. Nikita Khrushchev knew well the power of propaganda and the voice of the church. And already the satellite countries were in trouble, and Russia was in trouble too. So he said, provided there's no condemnation of Marxism by the church or of the USSR, and he had several other things besides that, but that was the main thing, then I will grant permission for 2 observers. The negotiations were carried on by Cardinal Tisserand, a French cardinal, in the house of the Bishop of de Smet. He was a French bishop in Metz, in the city of Metz. And they were concluded satisfactorily, and the two observers arrived. The Rome-Moscow agreement therefore meant that there was an unofficial line between the Vatican and the Kremlin from then on. That had been established, by the way, during the war by a man called Monsignore Giovanni Battista Montini, behind Pius XII's back. And Pius XII was utterly enraged when he found it. It was one of the reasons why finally he expelled Montini and made him Archbishop of Milano. And then for later on, after his death, he became, as you know, Paul VI. And another man who was very active at that time in the Vatican State Department was Agostino Casaroli.
We know a lot about him.
Yes. He's the Secretary of State. And he gathered around him an entire band of people who are very anti-American, very anti-Anglo-Saxon, and it's not that they want to become communists. They just believe that the pie can be carved up differently. And they never got very far until John Paul II came in with his personal charisma and made it possible for us to have this interview with Gorbachev. But that's a completely different question, what is happening now under John Paul II. The trend in the Vatican was to allow the Marxist idea to pervade Christianity, which emerged, as you know, in liberation theology in Latin America, and was never suppressed, even though John Paul II has made more than 3 trips to Latin America to suppress it. And that was the Rome-Moscow Pact, and it's still in vogue. It's still in vogue. And Rome has not gone back on it. Vatican diplomacy is such that once a mistake has been made, it generally tries to live with it. It rarely tries to obliterate the mistake. Rarely does. So it has lived with this all during the reign of Paul VI, and there were contacts. All the bully boys of the satellite nations went to see Paul VI in the 70s, and President Podgorny, Nikolai Podgorny, way back in 1967, I think, came to the Vatican to see him, and Paul VI used to receive this famous man, Metropolitan Nikojin, who was the go-between. He was the Metropolitan Bishop of Leningrad and Ladoga, second highest ranking bishop in the Soviet Union. It was he who negotiated with Tito on this Moscow Pact, and it was he who died in the arms of John Paul I, as you know.
Do you think that the Russian Orthodox Church, led by Nikodem, is very much a puppet church?
Absolutely a puppet church. It's as one Russian said to me, it is deviled. I can't translate the Russian word in any other way. He said, we have been servants of the devil for so long, we have forgotten what we are. And if you want to measure, Bernard, the amount of devilment in the Russian Orthodox Church as an organization, think of the following fact, that nobody can be of any prominence in the Russian Orthodox Church unless he's a member of the KGB. Nikodym himself was a colonel in the KGB. He was tortured 11 times by the KGB. They thought he was turning tail on them, which he finally did.
What do Catholics behind the Iron Curtain think about the Rome-Moscow Agreement?
First of all, let's be clear on the condition of Catholics behind the Iron Curtain. Contrary to what a lot of people would like to think, the condition of youth and the condition of the church behind the Iron Curtain is almost worse than the condition of the church in the United States and Europe. Almost worse. But there are solid bodies of believers who have clung on, mainly in the Ukraine, by the way, where you have 4 to 5 million Ukrainians who literally have been having Mass in forest glades and behind rocks, much as the Irish had for 400 years during the British occupation of Ireland. Now, they have regarded all contact with the Soviet Union as abhorrent, because they lived with the commissars. They felt the whips. They were sent to the Gulag. They lost their priests and bishops and nuns and churches and convents. They regarded it as blasphemy. They couldn't understand it, and they don't understand it, because they had lived with the demon called Marxism under Stalin and Nikita Khrushchev, and under Mr. Gorbachev, and under all the intermediary figures. They know the truth about everything. They have no illusions whatever. And if you talk with people like Cardinal Tomaszek of Prague, who's now free to say his Mass over the television, you'll find that his eyes film over when you question him about the goodness and the wisdom of the Rome-Moscow Pact. They regard themselves as having been delivered lock, stock, and barrel into the hands of the Soviets. Because they say, if at any given moment Rome had flung its full weight publicly, against the Soviet Union, as Pius XII tried to, but at that stage he was almost 80 and physically too weak and psychologically broken down. And already the tentacles were spreading into the Vatican. The tentacles of what they call the superforce, which is now within the Vatican bureaucracy itself. If the Church had done that, if the prestige it had coming out after the Second World War, the prestige was huge in America and in Canada and in Latin America. No doubt about it, it could have curbed what Stalin was doing. It could have curbed Nikita Khrushchev. It could have made a difference. We didn't do it. We compromised. One small example, I'll tell you. Paul VI got all the bishops of Vietnam assembled in Saigon and sent over a special emissary, a cardinal whose name begins Pignedoli, to tell them to advocate surrender and peace with North Vietnam. Total surrender. Why did he do that? He did that because he had been influenced by Metropolitan Nikodym, who brought a message from the North Vietnamese through Moscow that the North Vietnamese wanted peace, and they needed 6 months to prepare themselves. This was in 1968. In 1968, the United States had leveled North Vietnam. They had no hope of winning. So Lyndon Johnson was faced with the request from Paul VI that he not bomb any more, that he not do any more war destruction. He wait until spring. And what happened in spring, or February, the Tet Offensive. They had rearmed, and they came back like a lion. And from then on, it was downhill for the United States. But in the meantime, Paul VI got his bishops to vote for peace, against any furtherance of war, any resistance. And that is called compromise. And compromise was the message. Compromise, sacrifice, wait. Which is not the action of a militant church conscious of its own strength. It was compromise. And the result was that Mindszenty, for instance, was hauled out of the legation in Budapest, where he had been for 15 years, promised that nobody would be made cardinal in his lifetime, put in a seminary in Vienna, and immediately they appointed a new man, Lecoy, who was a Marxist. He's dead now, the cardinal. But he was an open Marxist. There was compromise all over the place. That was the result of the Moscow Pact. And the result was that when the Latin Americans in the late 70s started with their liberation theology, everybody said, well, the church has a pacific approach to all this, and obviously you can Christianize Marxism. Well, what happened was they Marxized Christianity, because liberation theology is merely Marxism with a Christian faith. Christ becomes the revolutionary. Mary is the mother of all the revolutionaries. The bread of life is no longer in the tabernacle. The bread of life is now what we manufacture in our factory, which no longer belongs to the...
It's a materialistic ideology then.
But in Christian terminology. That's the point.